Welcome to the In His Grip podcast with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Building a Spiritual Legacy.
Of course we don't trust you. You're not wise enough. You don't know what you're talking about. You haven't lived long enough to figure this out. Now, one day you will understand. But until then, I'm going to teach you what wisdom looks like. You see, fear of the Lord is where wisdom begins. The most critical issue before your children is the fact that there is nothing that can satisfy the inner longings of our souls, short of that for which your soul was created. Because you see, you were created in the image and likeness of God. And it is only as we aspire to the image and likeness of God that we will find the longings of our souls fulfilled. Satan's MO involves two things. He creates in you a weak spot, and then he infects the weak spot. He creates the weak spot, and then he infects the weak spot. I'll give you a for example. Every child enters into a marriage with baggage. Every one of you married in the context of bringing your own baggage. Those are the created weak spots, the things you learned from your parents. The infections occur when those weak spots are pounced upon by the evil one. You learned things from your mom as to how to treat a man. You've learned from your father how to treat a woman. You've been shaped both positively and negatively. Some more positively, some more negatively by the people who raised you. And because of the negative influences, you walk into a marriage infected. There are things you carry into the marriage that you learned in the context of parents who raised you, some for the good and some for evil. All of us are shaped by that. If the statistics are true, 50% of you came from a broken home. That shaped you. There are no healings possible in divorce situations. You only learn to adjust to a new level of normal. The damage is already caused. You can't undo the damage to a child caused by a divorce. You simply learn to cope with it and adjust to a different level of normal. So if 50% of you have been infected negatively, impacted negatively by divorce, there's already a weak spot there. The pattern for divorce has already been established. The pattern to walk away is already there. There's nothing you can do about that except to excise it by the power of the Spirit. And on I can go. For example, if you boys were raised by a father who gawked at girls, who whistled at pretty little girls, who told dirty, crass, cruel, and immoral jokes, then it's highly likely you're going to walk into a marriage with that same mindset. If your mother was a loud, abusive mother, if your mother was not practicing godly discipline in the home and biblical reverence for the family, then more than likely that's how you're going to enter the marriage. Handling money, the worship traditions, what you believe, what you don't believe, on and on the list goes. But let's add one. Let's add, how do we face moral temptation? How did your mother and your father face moral temptation? How did they teach you to face moral temptation? Is there adultery in your family structure? Is there desertion in your family structure? Well, you bring two people together with different bags and they form a marriage made up of bags from this marriage and bags from that marriage. That is why you must be wise in who you marry. You know, children can be very lonely. Loneliness in children breeds fear. And fear always alienates from the love of God. That's why the Bible says perfect love casteth out all fear, and the perfect love, of course, is Christ. When a child is lonely, a child becomes afraid. Any form of intimacy is difficult for children who are lonely. because they're often driven to fear and to self-dependency just to survive. Some of them actually form different kinds of personalities to cope with different kinds of situations. We find this with children who have been sexually abused. They develop a coping mechanism just to deal with the abuse, just to create this other person in order to handle the pain that came from that situation. Otherwise, they'd be destroyed. All of us, to one degree or another, have multiple personalities. You say, how do I know that? Because I am different around you than I am around my wife. I am different around my wife than I am around my enemy. I am different around my enemy than I am among the various people in my life. We develop differing coping mechanisms in order to just socially survive. But imagine a lonely child who has gone inside of himself or herself. You know what happens there? They have great difficulty developing any sense of intimacy. They don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. They're very likely to seek out anonymous relationships because they never really want to get too close to anyone. Your secret porn addictors, the people who are addicted to porn, are people who are having anonymous affairs because they're lonely and they're sinful. And we come to places in our lives where we have to learn to cope with the loneliness and cope with the fear, but they soon discover none of this ever satisfies. All that they've reached out to fill the void never really satisfies. Because you see, we were created to think through the consequences of our actions. We can remain victims for the rest of our lives. We can live as victims ad nauseum. And yet Christ is the one who calls us not to be victims, but to be victors. That is why we will never have true intimacy with another human being, true intimacy the way God created it to be, apart from faith in Jesus Christ in you and faith in Jesus Christ in that person in whom you desire that intimacy. That is why we tell young people all the time, marry the right person. And we're lonely. And what happens in that loneliness is there is great fear. There's a loss of intimacy. The moral restraints are taken down because the child continues to look for any and every possible way in which he can satisfy the void that exists in his or her heart. Thus, the weak spot is created. Satan knows he has now created the weak spot. He has used the sin of the parents to visit on that child to the third and the fourth generation. We have seen this even in adopted children. When we trace back the sin that exists in that adopted adult, that adopted child who becomes an adult, oftentimes we're able to trace back the sin patterns to a parent they never even knew. Why? Because the sins of the parents are visited to the third and to the fourth generations. So the weak spot is created. Now, what does Satan do with the weak spot? He infects it. He brings them face to face with moral temptations that in that infected state they cannot and will not handle. He gives us a graphic example. Again, remember, the first 9 chapters designed for 12 years of age and under. Look at Proverbs chapter 7. You want to talk about graphic? Here it is. Proverbs chapter 7. Now, I know there are children present, so I'm going to try to be as generic as I can, but I hope you adults can read through the lines. Proverbs 7, verse 6. At the window of my house, I looked out through the lattice. I saw among the simple. My translation, teenager. It's not accurate, but it's close. I saw among the simple. I noticed among the young men. A youth who lacked judgment. Got the picture? This guy is eavesdropping. He looks out the lattice of his window and he sees a kid about to make a very serious mistake because he's a fool. He's never been taught how to handle moral temptation. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house. Now listen to me closely. This boy has already sinned. He hasn't even met the woman he's going to meet. He's already sinned. He knew she lived there. And when he was over here, and the guy in the window was looking through his lattice, the moment that kid turned and headed toward her house, the sin was already committed. Moral failure had already occurred. He's moving now in her direction. He knows she's there, and he's moving that way. Verse 9, at twilight. That's when the roaches come out, by the way. It's at nighttime most crimes occur because we don't think anybody sees. Yet it is clear as we read these passages that God's eyes run to and fro, and he knows not only what you're doing, but what you're thinking about doing. He knows what's in your head right now. He knows what thoughts and thought patterns are going through your mind right now. He knows some of you young people are trying to figure out a way right now in which to convince yourself that the man standing up there yelling at you is wrong. God knows that. He knows that's what you're thinking. And I may be wrong, but on this I'm not. And so he goes, in verse 8, he was going down the street toward her house at twilight, as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in. Got the picture? What's the first word of verse 10? What? Then. When? Here's the infection. Here is the scenario. Satan has now set up this fool for failure. He made the turn. He's standing there now in front of a house where he has no business being. Then, I would read that then and only then. Out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute, and with crafty intent. Now, by the way, I want you to notice it doesn't say she was a prostitute. It just says she was dressed like one. I believe there's ample evidence and indication here this girl was not a prostitute. She just liked to dress in such a way that men would look at her. She liked to wear the clothing in such a way that men would be attracted to her. Because you see, she knew that fundamentally men are stimulated by sight and women are most stimulated by touch. So for him to look was going to conjure up images for him that would be very difficult for him to handle. And she had a crafty intent. In other words, she had cooked up a plan. Now, there's indication in that if this girl has cooked up a plan that she has seen this guy before. He's been hanging around her house before. And when he hung around her house maybe once or twice, the snake did not bite. But now the infection is setting in. The weak spot has been created. The infection has come in. Adultery very rarely happens overnight. Guys think about it for a long time. So do girls. You don't just suddenly wake up one morning and say, I'm going to commit adultery. You're usually hanging around the house of the adulterer or the adulteress for a long period of time prior. You're communing. You're having an innocent relationship. You're just friends. You're just hanging out. But notice what happens. She is loud and defiant. Two characteristics of a woman that the scripture clearly condemns. Now, loud does not mean loud speaking. Loud refers to the obnoxiousness of public behavior. Defiant refers to the spirit. Here is a woman lacking submission to God-ordained authority who is loud and rebellious, obstinate, and convinced that she is going to be in control of her life. No one is going to tell this woman what she can and cannot do. Now, verse 12, in the street, now in the squares, at every corner she lurks. Look at verse 11. Her feet never stay at home. In other words, where she is going is for the purpose of trouble. 50% of you are not going to agree with what I'm about to say. And it will depend on whether or not you're a man or a woman. But I would venture to say that most of the men sitting here will agree with me on this, unless you're an animal. 50% of the men, or all of the men will sit here. Most of the 50% of this congregation will absolutely agree with me on this. When it comes to moral temptation, I hold the woman responsible in a way different than I hold the man. Because a woman can and ought to make it clear to the man, you're off limits. And unless the man's an animal, he's going to back off the moment he sees you are not interested.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Friday on the In His Grip podcast.